Have you ever wondered what true, agonizing price was paid for the most beautiful art in history? That beauty, carved from stone and painted onto heavens, came from a man we think we know, but his reality was one of endless struggle. Tonight, we're walking into the dusty workshops of Renaissance Florence to find the real Michelangelo. It's so wonderful to have you here with us on this journey. If you enjoy our stories, a quick like or subscribe truly helps our little community grow. And I'm always so curious to know where our stories are traveling. Please feel free to share in the comments what time it is and where in the world you're settling in from tonight. For now, find your coziest spot, take a slow, deep breath, and let's begin. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we travel back to the 15th century, to a small town near Florence, where a boy was born who would change the world, whether he wanted to or not. His story begins on March 6, 1475. He was born in the small Tuscan town of Caprese, a quiet place nestled in the hills. His full name was Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni. His father, Lodovico, was a man of some local importance. He served as the town's magistrate, a position of legal and administrative authority. This role gave the Buonarroti family a certain standing. They were, in fact, minor nobility. They had a name, a lineage they could trace back for generations. This status was, in Lodovico's mind, their most precious possession. It was the one thing that separated them from the merchants and the craftsmen, the laborers and the farmers. But this nobility was a fragile, hollow thing, because the family had very little money. Lodovico was obsessed with this contradiction. He clung to the idea of their social standing with a white-knuckled grip. The family's honor, their name, was everything. Their actual wealth, or lack thereof, was a source of constant, private anxiety. He dreamed of his sons restoring the family's fortunes, not through grubby trade, but through respectable, educated professions. Into this world of quiet desperation, young Michelangelo arrived. His early years were marked by a profound loss. His mother, Francesca di Neri, was a gentle presence, but one that would fade all too soon. She was often frail, and when Michelangelo was just 6 years old, she passed away. Her death cast a long shadow. The family home, already strained by Lodovico's anxieties, became a colder place. The halls seemed to echo with a new emptiness. Michelangelo, a sensitive and solitary child, was suddenly adrift. Perhaps it was for this reason, or perhaps for reasons of custom and convenience, that he was not raised in Florence with his father. Instead, he was sent away. He was fostered by a family in the nearby town of Settignano. This simple move would prove to be the single most important event of his young life. Settignano was not like Florence. It was not a city of bankers and silk merchants. It was a town built on rock. It was a place of quarries. The very air was different. From dawn until dusk, the town was filled with a constant, percussive song. It was the sharp, clear, unending sound of hammers striking chisels. Chink, chink, chink. This was the sound of the stonecutters. The family who took him in was part of this world. His wet nurse was the wife of a stonecutter, and her home was surrounded by the industry of marble. The smell of damp earth and raw quarried stone was in everything. The ground itself was white with marble dust. For a young boy, this was a world of wonder. He grew up breathing in this dust. The rough texture of a simple wool tunic, perpetually covered in the pale powder, became his second skin. He watched the men work. He saw them take rough, shapeless blocks of stone and, with strength and precision, find the forms hidden within. He played with the cast-off chips of marble. He learned to hold the tools. Years later, Michelangelo would joke about this time. He claimed that he sucked in his love of chisels and marble with his wet nurse's milk. It was more than a joke, it was the truth. While his father dreamed of balancing ledgers or studying Latin, his son was falling in love with the most basic, physical, and, in Lodovico's eyes, the most degrading of all materials, stone. As he grew, this love found an outlet. He began to draw. He sketched constantly. He drew the men in the quarry. He drew the hills around the town. He drew the statues he saw in the local church. The scratch of a rough piece of charcoal on torn scraps of paper was his secret language. It had to be a secret because his father was horrified. When Michelangelo was brought back to his father's house in Florence, the conflict began. Lodovico had plans for his son. He was to be a man of letters. He was enrolled in humanist studies, meant to prepare him for a career in business or bureaucracy. But the boy was not interested in grammar. He was not interested in arithmetic. He was only interested in drawing. He neglected his lessons. He sought out the company of other artists, boys who were already learning the trade. To Lodovico, this was a betrayal. It was a disgrace. In the mind of a 15th century minor noble, being an artist was not a lofty, romantic calling. It was manual labor. Painters and sculptors were craftsmen. They were in the same guild as the apothecaries, who sold spices and pigments. They worked with their hands. They got dirty. They were paid for their work, like a carpenter or a stonemason. This was beneath the dignity of a boy. The arguments were frequent. They were loud, and they were violent. Lodovico, in his frustration, would beat the young Michelangelo for his obsession. He saw the drawings not as signs of genius, but as symbols of failure. He saw them as a waste of time, a path toward social ruin. But the boy would not stop. He could not. He found an ally, a slightly older boy named Francesco Granacci. Granacci was already an apprentice, and he recognized the raw, untamed talent in Michelangelo's sketches. He encouraged him. He smuggled him drawings to copy. He told him stories of the great workshops, the asterisk bottegas, asterisk, that were the beating heart of Florentine art. Michelangelo's resolve hardened. This was not a hobby. This was his destiny. He resisted his father's will with a stubbornness that matched and even surpassed Lodovico's own. And so, at last, his father broke. The arguments had exhausted him. The boy's singular, fiery focus was something he could not defeat. Perhaps Granacci or others had spoken to him, assuring him of his son's prodigious talent. Finally, at the age of 13, in the year 1488, Lodovico relented. With a heart full of deep resentment, he signed the official papers. He was, in his own mind, condemning his son to a life of manual labor. He was signing away the family's honor, but in reality, he was signing the birth of the Renaissance. The contract bound his son for a 3-year apprenticeship. The master was not just any artist. He was Domenico Ghirlandaio, the owner of the largest, most successful, and most fashionable painting workshop in all of Florence. His father's reluctant signature was the key. It unlocked the door to this bustling, thriving world. And his first great teacher, imagine a 13-year-old boy, accustomed to the quiet of the quarry and the cold disapproval of his father's house, stepping into the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio. It was not a quiet, contemplative studio. It was a massive, humming enterprise, a factory of art. Ghirlandaio was the most sought-after painter in Florence, and his bottega was flooded with massive commissions. He was painting entire chapels, creating enormous altarpieces, and his workshop was a hive of activity. The air was thick with smells. There was the strong, earthy scent of raw pigments, red ochre from the earth, green earth, yellow sienna. There was the sharp, stinging, chemical scent of lime, used to prepare the wet plaster for frescoes. And underneath it all, the faint, organic smell of eggs, their yolks, used to bind the paint for panels. It was also loud. The constant buzz of chatter filled the space. Dozens of apprentices and assistants, of all ages and skill levels, called out to one another, mixed pigments, prepared panels, and argued over drawings. Michelangelo, despite his obvious talent, started at the very bottom. That was the rule. An apprentice's life began with the most menial tasks. He would have swept the workshop floors, clearing away the dust, wood shavings, and charcoal scraps. He would have run errands, fetching wine for the master, delivering messages across the city, carrying heavy panels through the streets. His first artistic job was pure labor. He was taught to grind the pigments. This was a back-breaking, tedious process. He would take rough chunks of minerals, like the beautiful blue lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, or the green malachite, and place them on a hard porphyry slab. For hours, he would stand and grind the chunks with a stone muller, back and forth, until the hard mineral was reduced to a powder as fine as flour. The quality of the paint depended entirely on this work. After this, he learned to prepare the surfaces. He was taught how to take heavy wooden panels and apply layers of gesso, a mixture of animal skin, glue, and plaster, sanding each layer until the surface was as smooth and white as ivory. He learned the chemistry of paint. He learned how to mix the finely ground pigments with the yolk of an egg, creating the luminous, fast-drying medium known as egg tempera. But the core skill of Ghirlandaio's workshop, the one that made him so famous, was fresco. This was buon fresco, or true fresco. It was the art of painting directly onto a wall covered in wet plaster. This was the most demanding, unforgiving, and prestigious technique a painter could master. Michelangelo was plunged into this high-stakes world. He learned to help the plasterers, smoothing the final, thin layer of plaster, the intonaco, onto the wall each morning. The texture had to be perfect, gritty, and wet, ready to receive the paint. And then the race began. Fresco is a relentless race against time. The artist must complete a section of the painting known as the giornata or day's work before the plaster dries. Once it dries, the pigment will no longer bind with the lime. It is permanent. There is no going back, no correcting mistakes. You must be fast. You must be confident. The young Michelangelo thrived in this environment. His primary education was copying. He would study the master's drawings and, most importantly, the massive fresco cycles Ghirlandaio was famous for. He spent hours in places like the Tornabuone Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria Novella. There, he would stand and sketch, looking up at the massive, colorful, detailed scenes that covered the walls. He was not just learning to draw figures, he was learning to tell a story. Ghirlandaio was a master of capturing contemporary Florentine life. He painted biblical scenes, but he populated them with the rich and powerful of his own city. He painted portraits of wealthy bankers and their elegant wives, dressed in the latest fashions, right alongside the saints and angels. Michelangelo absorbed this all. He learned composition. He learned how to create the illusion of depth. He learned how to paint the texture of silk and the gleam of gold. But it soon became clear that this was no ordinary apprentice. The contract his father had signed was highly unusual. Most apprentices had to pay for their training, or, at best, they worked for free in exchange for room and board. Michelangelo's contract was different. It stated that he would be paid for his work. He was to receive 6 florins in the first year. This was a tiny sum, but it was a profound acknowledgement. Ghirlandaio had seen the boy's drawings and knew, even at 13, that this was not a student to be taught, but a talent to be harnessed. His development was explosive. The biographers who later wrote about his life, Giorgio Vasari and Ascanio Condivi, both claim that Michelangelo surpassed his master with astonishing speed. They tell stories, perhaps romanticized, of how the young apprentice would correct his master's drawings. They claim that Ghirlandaio grew jealous of his pupil's staggering genius, this fiery, obsessive boy who seemed to understand form and shadow better than anyone. Whether the jealousy was real or not, the talent was undeniable. Michelangelo was not just learning, he was mastering. He was absorbing the lessons of fresco painting, of composition, of capturing the human form. But this incredible talent was housed in a difficult, challenging, and abrasive personality. He was brilliant, but he was also arrogant. He was critical of others, and not quiet about it. This combination of genius and arrogance was about to have a violent, permanent consequence. One encounter in a chapel with a fellow student would mark him quite literally for the rest of his life. In 15th century Florence, there was a place that served as an unofficial school for all aspiring artists. It was not a workshop, it was a chapel, the Sistine Chapel, in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine. Decades earlier, this chapel had been decorated with revolutionary frescoes by a young artist named Masaccio. Masaccio had changed painting forever. He painted figures that had real weight, real human emotion. They weren't flat, divine symbols. They were people. They suffered. They grieved. They stood on the earth. To a young artist like Michelangelo, this chapel was the most important classroom in the world. He and other students would gather there in the cold, echoing silence, a silence broken only by the sound of charcoal whispering across paper. They came to draw, to copy Masaccio's masterpieces, to unlock his secrets. One day, Michelangelo was there, sketching, as he often was. He was surrounded by other young artists, all doing the same. Among them was a boy named Pietro Torrigiano. Was not without talent. He was a capable sculptor, but he was also known for his personality, which was the opposite of the refined, philosophical world of art. He was, by all accounts, brutish. He was arrogant, quick to anger, and known for his violent nature. Michelangelo, for his part, was already developing his famously sharp tongue, his lingua tagliente, He was young, he was brilliant, and he knew it. He was intensely critical, not just of his fellow students, even his master, Ghirlandaio, but of everyone. He looked at the art of the past and found it lacking. We will never know exactly what was said. The details are lost to time. Perhaps Michelangelo made a critical remark about Torrigiano's drawing. Perhaps he insulted another artist that Torrigiano admired. Whatever the words were, they were sharp. They were arrogant, and they found their mark. Torrigiano, full of rage, did not respond with words. he turned on Michelangelo. In his own later account of the incident, Torrigiano boasted about what happened next. He was proud of it. He said he gave him such a blow on the nose that I felt the bone and cartilage smash like a biscuit. The sound was sudden, a sharp, sickening crack that shattered the holy silence of the chapel. Then came the pain, intense, blinding pain. Michelangelo crumpled, his face in his hands. The warm, metallic smell of fresh blood filled his senses. He was carried from the chapel, disfigured and in agony. The punch had been devastating. It had completely flattened the bridge of his nose, crushing the bone and cartilage. This was not an injury that would heal. It was permanent. For the rest of his long life, Michelangelo's face would bear the mark of this single, violent moment. We can only imagine the hot, immediate shame he must have felt. He was a man obsessed with ideal beauty, with the perfection of the human form. Yet, when he looked at his own reflection in a puddle or a piece of polished metal, he would see a distorted, swollen face. He would see a broken, flattened nose. This disfigurement became a source of great insecurity and shame. He was known to be vain, and this permanent flaw was a humiliation he would carry forever. The consequences for Torrigiano were immediate. The act was seen as barbaric. Michelangelo was already seen as a prodigious talent, and this attack was indefensible. Torrigiano was banished from the city of Florence. He fled, his life sent on a completely different trajectory. He became a mercenary, a soldier, and eventually an artist, again working in England and Spain, forever living in the shadow of the one man he had permanently scarred. Michelangelo was left to heal. This incident only seemed to cement his reputation. He was brilliant, yes, but he was difficult. He was a solitary figure, isolated by his own genius and his abrasive nature. His disfigurement, however, did not hide that genius. It could not. And that genius, which had already made him stand out in Ghirlandaio's workshop and in the silent chapels of Florence, had attracted the gaze of the single most powerful and most magnificent man in the city. This man was Lorenzo de' Medici. He was known to all of Florence as Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. He was the head of the Medici banking family, and though Florence was technically a republic, Lorenzo was its de facto ruler. He was a poet, a brilliant statesman, and the greatest art patron of his age. Lorenzo had a particular passion. He believed that while painting had been reborn in Florence, the art of sculpture, the glory of ancient Rome, was still lost. He was determined to revive it. To this end, he maintained a special sculpture garden near the monastery of San Marco. This garden was his personal academy. It was filled with priceless, ancient Roman and Greek marble statues from his personal collection. It was a place for study, for inspiration. Lorenzo had an agreement with Domenico Ghirlandaio. He asked the master painter to send his very best pupils, the ones with the most potential, to the garden. He wanted them to study the ancient statues, to learn the lost language of three-dimensional form. Ghirlandaio sent Michelangelo. This was the moment his life changed. He was no longer just grinding pigments or copying frescoes. He was finally, truly, working with stone. The famous story of this period, likely romanticized by Vasari, centers on a single sculpture. Michelangelo, still just a boy of 14 or 15, was given a piece of marble. He chose to copy an ancient, battered head of a faun, a mythical woodland creature. But he did not just copy it. He looked at the ancient statue, and then he changed it. With a cleverness that went far beyond mere technical skill, he aged the faun. he added wrinkles around the eyes. And then he carved a gap in the fawn's open mouth, drilling a small hole deep into the stone, as if a tooth had fallen out from old age. Lorenzo the Magnificent came to walk through his garden and inspect the student's work. He saw Michelangelo's fawn. He was immediately charmed. This was not simple imitation. This was observation. This was wit. This was invention. Lorenzo smiled and supposedly joked with the young artist. "You should have known," he said, "that old men never have all their teeth. You left him too many." The story goes that as soon as Lorenzo walked away, Michelangelo immediately took his chisel, knocked out one of the fawn's teeth, and refined the gum line, making the joke a reality. When Lorenzo returned and saw the change, he was astonished. He was captivated by this boy's skill, his cleverness, and his fiery, immediate confidence. This was the genius he had been looking for. And so, around the year 1489, Lorenzo de' Medici made an incredible gesture. He invited the 15-year-old Michelangelo to come and live in the Medici Palace on the Via Larga. This was not an apprenticeship. This was, effectively, an adoption. Imagine the change. This was the boy who had been beaten for drawing the son of a minor noble, obsessed with his family's poverty. Suddenly, he was living in the very center of power, wealth, and intellect in all of Europe. He was given his own room. He was given a stipend for his work. He was even given a fine violet cloak, a clear symbol of his status as a special protégé of the house. Most incredibly, he was given a seat at the family table. This was not just a meal. This was an education. He sat and ate with Lorenzo's own sons, boys who would grow up to be popes in Rome. The table was laden with the smell of expensive spices and roasted meats, a world away from his father's frugal home and the company. He was no longer just an apprentice. He was suddenly immersed in the highest, most elite intellectual circle of the entire Renaissance. After dinner, he would sit in the opulent halls, surrounded by silks, velvets, and priceless artworks, and he would listen. He would hear the sound of learned, complex, philosophical debates in classical Latin and Greek. At that table sat the great minds of the age, men like Marsilio Ficino, the philosopher who was translating the works of Plato for the first time. There was the brilliant Pico della Mirandola, who claimed to have read every book in existence. And there was the poet Angelo Poliziano, who taught Michelangelo about classical literature and myth. He, a stonecutter's son dining with princes and poets, felt a profound awe. He was breathing the very air of Neoplatonic philosophy, ideas about divine beauty and the human soul that would shape his art for the rest of his life. This world of Renaissance Florence is so rich with incredible stories and characters. Is there another artist, or perhaps a different time in history altogether, that you've always dreamed of exploring? Please let me know in the comments. Ideas are always the best inspiration. As Michelangelo settled into this new life, he was about to face his first true test as a master sculptor. He was no longer just an apprentice. He was a protégé. This new world would fuel his art, but his fiery, independent spirit would soon clash with a new, powerful, and very different kind of rival. He was no longer just an apprentice. He was a protégé, breathing the very air of Neoplatonic philosophy. This new world would fuel his art, but his fiery, independent spirit would soon clash with a new, powerful, and very different kind of rival. For now, however, Life in the Medici palace was a dream. This idyllic period, from around 1489 to 1492, was perhaps the only time of true peace and intellectual nourishment Michelangelo would ever know. He had been plucked from a world of stone dust and his father's angry disapproval and placed in the very center of the Renaissance. The atmosphere was one of wondrous, intellectual calm. He ate at Lorenzo's table, listening to the low, quiet hum of complex conversation. He was granted access to Lorenzo's private library, a place that smelled of old parchment and rich, leather-bound books, filled with texts he had only dreamed of. In the dappled sunlight of the San Marco garden, he studied the serene marble faces of ancient Roman and Greek statues. But he was not just learning to copy them, he was learning the why behind them. From the philosophers at Lorenzo's table, he absorbed the ideas of Neoplatonism. This philosophy would become the core of his artistic soul. The idea was simple but profound. They taught him that the physical body was merely a vessel, a temporary prison for the divine soul. Beauty, true beauty, was the physical expression of that divinity. And so, Michelangelo formed his life's guiding principle. The sculptor was not a mere craftsman, he was a liberator. His job was not to create a form, but to reveal the perfect, divine idea already trapped inside the block of marble. The sculptor's hand, guided by his mind, simply chipped away the excess stone to set the beautiful form free. This philosophy is visible in the very first works he created. He carved the Madonna of the Stairs around 1491. It was a laurel leaf plaque, a form made popular by the earlier master Donatello. But where Donatello's work was often graceful and light, Michelangelo's was somber. It was monumental. The figures felt heavy, carved with a new kind of seriousness. But his true thesis statement was the Battle of the Centaurs. The poet Poliziano, one of the brilliant minds at the Medici table, suggested the theme from a classical myth. Michelangelo, still just a teenager, took the idea and forged it into something the world had never seen. He carved a chaotic, tangled mass of muscular nudes. The sight of these twisting, muscular bodies seems to be literally emerging from the flat, rough slab of stone. It is a work of controlled violence, of pure energy. It was a radical departure from the calm, orderly, and pious art of the early Renaissance. This was something new. It was a celebration of the human form in all its power and struggle. It was the first true expression of his obsession. Michelangelo was so profoundly proud of this work that he kept it with him for his entire life. It was his beginning. It was his manifesto. But this period of philosophical and artistic bliss, this perfect world of intellectual conversation and cool, polished marble, was fragile. It was all held together by one man. In April of 1492, Lorenzo the Magnificent died. The death of his patron shattered Michelangelo's world. The protective bubble burst. Lorenzo's son, Piero, was weak, arrogant, and lacked his father's political skill. The city of Florence, held in a delicate balance by Lorenzo, began to grow unstable. And into this vacuum of power, a new, terrifying voice rose to power. It was a voice that saw Michelangelo's art, his beloved nudes, his pagan myths, not as divine, but as profoundly and damnably sinful. The man's name was Girolamo Savonarola. He was a Dominican friar, a fire and brimstone preacher who had been railing against the Medici for years. He saw their Florence as a sink of corruption, luxury, and pagan art. His thundering, terrifying voice echoed through the Duomo, the great cathedral, promising apocalyptic doom. He preached that God's wrath was coming to cleanse the city. He gained a massive, fanatical following. They were known as the Piagnon asterisk, or the Weepers, for the public, hysterical displays of penance they would perform. They saw Savonarola as a true prophet. In 1494, the prophecy seemed to come true. The King of France, Charles VIII, invaded Italy. As the French army approached Florence, the terrified citizens, spurred on by Savonarola's sermons, turned on their weak leader. Piero de' Medici and his entire family were formally exiled from the city. For Michelangelo, this was a disaster. He was a known Medici protege. He had lived in their palace. He was associated with the very pagan luxury that Savonarola was preaching against. Fearing for his safety in the new fanatical, political, and religious climate, he fled. He left his home city a refugee, feeling the fear and uncertainty of the dusty road. He went first to Venice, and then to Bologna. There, he was an unknown. He found shelter in the cold, unfamiliar churches, a displaced artist looking for work. He eventually received a small commission. It was not a grand new project, but a task to finish the work of another. He was hired to carve 3 small, elegant statues for the magnificent shrine of Saint Dominic. He was working, but he was in exile. Back in Florence, the chaos reached its peak. Savonarola was now the de facto ruler of a new, purified republic. His power culminated in 1497 with the infamous bonfire of the Vanities. In the Piazza della Signoria, the great main square, his followers built a massive bonfire. Into it, they threw thousands of sinful objects, mirrors, fine clothes, musical instruments, books of poetry, and most tragically, paintings and drawings. The acrid smell of smoke, of burning paint, and of scorched parchment filled the air as years of Renaissance culture were turned to ash. This period left a deep, complex, and permanent mark on Michelangelo's psyche. He was a profoundly religious man. He believed in God, but he also believed in the divinity of beauty. Savonarola's reign created a conflict within him that would haunt his later deeply spiritual art. The cycle of fanaticism, however, consumed its creator. Savonarola's defiance of the Pope eventually led to his own downfall. He was excommunicated, and in 1498 he was publicly tortured and burned at the stake in the very same square where his bonfires had burned. Florence was in turmoil, but Michelangelo was about to find his destiny elsewhere. After this period of chaos, he traveled south to the center of the ancient world. He went to Rome. He arrived in the Eternal City in 1496. It was a landscape of giants. The immense, crumbling ruins of the Roman Forum were everywhere. He was walking in the footsteps of the ancient masters he idolized. His first opportunity came not from a commission, but from a clever bit of forgery. He sculpted a beautiful sleeping Cupid in a perfect, antique style. A Roman art dealer, seeing the work, had an idea. He encouraged Michelangelo to age the statue, to bury it in the earth, to make it look like a recently discovered Roman antique. They would sell it for a huge profit. The plan worked. The statue was sold to a high-ranking church official, Cardinal Raphael Riadio. Eventually, the cardinal discovered the forgery, but his reaction was not what they had feared. He was so utterly astonished by the skill of the living artist who could perfectly replicate an ancient masterpiece that he invited Michelangelo to Rome. This forgery This act of artistic deception was his ticket to the big leagues. In 1498, this new reputation earned him the commission that would change his life. A French cardinal, Jean de Bilhers-Lagralles, approached him. He wanted a sculpture for his own tomb, which would be placed in a chapel in St. Peter's Basilica, the very heart of the Christian world. The subject was a pute, the Virgin Mary, mourning over the dead body of her son, Christ. Michelangelo, now 23, understood the weight of this task. He would not use just any piece of stone. He traveled personally to the quarries of Carrara. Imagine that place. A mountain of white, the blinding white light reflecting off the stone, the deafening noise of hundreds of men cutting and hauling. He spent months there, walking the quarries, inspecting the stone, searching for one single, perfect, flawless block of marble. He found it. He had it shipped to Rome, and he completed the revolutionary work in 1499. It took him less than 2 years. When it was unveiled, it stunned the city. It was a blend of classical beauty and profound religious emotion that no one had ever seen. Mary was depicted as ethereally, impossibly young, her face serene and timeless, not broken by grief. This was a divine, theological statement, not a human tragedy. The body of Christ was rendered with an anatomical perfection that was breathtaking. The sculpture was, in a word, perfect. In fact, it was so perfect that people refused to believe it was by this young 24-year-old Florentine. The echoing silence of St. Peter's Basilica was filled with whispers. Surely, it must have been done by a more established, more famous sculptor. This, the young, proud, and fiery Michelangelo could not tolerate. The story told by his biographer Vasari is one of the most famous in art history. In a fit of furious pride, Michelangelo snuck into the basilica at night. With his hammer and chisel by candlelight, he set to work. The quiet, rhythmic tap, dash, tap, tap, of his chisel was the only sound. He carved his name directly onto the polished sash that runs across Mary's chest. He wrote, Michelangelus Buonarrotis Florentinus Facobat. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this. It was the first and the only work he ever signed. He had announced himself to the world. He returned to Florence not as a refugee, but as a superstar. The city leaders of the new Florentine Republic, which had risen from the ashes of Savonarola's rule, had a new, colossal task for him. It was a task that would prove his genius, symbolize the city's liberty, and place him in direct public competition with the one man he truly despised. His rival was Leonardo da Vinci. The stage was set for a battle of titans. The two men could not have been more different, and they detested each other. Leonardo was the elder statesman. He was 23 years older than Michelangelo at the height of his fame. He was elegant, handsome, charming, a true Renaissance man. He was a scientific observer, a philosopher, and above all, a painter. He wrote in his notebooks that sculpture was a lesser art, a dirty and brutish mechanical exercise. Michelangelo was the young challenger. He was brutish, solitary, famously unkempt, and possessed a sharp tongue. He was a sculptor, to his very core. He believed sculpture was the supreme art form, the divine act of liberating form from stone. He saw painting as a shallow, two-dimensional illusion. Their mutual hatred was personal and public. An anonymous writer recorded how they traded sarcastic, biting insults in the public squares of Florence. The new republic gave Michelangelo his first challenge. They presented him with a ruined block of marble, a colossal 17-foot-tall piece that had been abandoned by other sculptors. It was known simply as the Giant. It was flawed, awkward, and had been left exposed to the elements for years. To any other artist, it was a lost cause. To Michelangelo, it was a test. He took the commission in 1501. He built a wooden shed around the massive stone, and for nearly 3 years, he worked in total secrecy. When the shed finally came down in 1504, it revealed the David asterisk. It was a masterpiece that redefined sculpture. This was not the young boy, victorious over the giant. This was David asterisk before asterisk the battle. Tense, watchful, defiant. His veins bulge. His eyes are fixed on his unseen enemy. It was the perfect symbol for the new Florentine Republic, young, beautiful, and defiant against all tyrants. The city immediately formed a committee to decide where this towering statue should be placed. And, of course, Leonardo da Vinci was on that committee. The tense, acrimonious atmosphere of the committee room was thick with rivalry. Leonardo, perhaps out of artistic jealousy, suggested placing the David asterisk in a less prominent spot, half hidden in a niche of the Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall. Michelangelo saw this as a deliberate, personal slight. He argued, and he won. The David asterisk, was placed in the most public spot possible, right in front of the main entrance, as a guardian for the city. The rivalry was now at a fever pitch. And so, in 1504, the city leaders decided to harness this fire of ambition. They staged a direct, public showdown. They commissioned both artists to paint enormous wall-sized battle frescoes, and they were to be painted on opposite walls of the Great Council Hall in the Palazzo Vecchio. It was a direct competition. The whole city was watching. Leonardo was assigned the Battle of Anghiari *. His preparatory drawing, or cartoon, showed a visceral, chaotic swirl of screaming men and terrified horses, a vortex of combat. Michelangelo was assigned the Battle of Sistine *. His subject was a group of Florentine soldiers, surprised by an attack while bathing in a river. This was a perfect subject for him, a brilliant excuse to paint what he loved, the male nude, in every possible twisting, muscular pose. The tension in the great council hall was immense. The two geniuses worked, shrouded in secrecy, each trying to create the greater masterpiece. But these, the lost masterpieces of the Renaissance, were never finished. Leonardo's painting technique failed, and his colors began to run. Michelangelo was summoned to Rome by a new, powerful pope before he could even begin painting on the wall. Their full-scale preparatory cartoons were left behind. They became a school for all the younger artists, who studied and copied them until years later, the precious drawings were torn to pieces by overeager students and lost forever. This burning rivalry between two of history's greatest minds is so fascinating, it makes one wonder. Does great genius truly need a great rival to push it to its limits? As Michelangelo fumed over Leonardo and the unfinished battle on the wall, a message arrived from Rome. It was a summons he could not refuse. This rivalry had defined the era. But while Michelangelo was winning the war for artistic supremacy in Florence, a new, powerful, and terrifyingly ambitious pope had summoned him back to Rome. He was being called not for another triumph, but for a task he never wanted. This rivalry defined the era. But while Michelangelo was winning the war for artistic supremacy in Florence, a new, powerful, and terrifyingly ambitious pope had summoned him back to Rome. He was not summoned for a triumph, but for a task that he never wanted. The summons came in the year 1505. The man calling him was Pope Julius II. This was not a humble man of God. He was known as the warrior pope. He was imperious, ambitious, and utterly terrifying. His thunderous, booming voice would echo in the halls of the Vatican. A man more comfortable on a battlefield than in a chapel. He was a man of grand, earthly ambitions. He wanted to restore the glory of Rome, and he wanted a tomb for himself that would rival the monuments of the ancient Caesars. This was the commission he offered to Michelangelo. It was not to be a simple wall tomb. It was to be a 3-story, freestanding monument, a work of architecture as much as sculpture. It was designed to hold over 40 life-sized statues, a mountain of perfect white marble. To Michelangelo, this was the dream of a lifetime. He was ecstatic. This was the work he was born for. This was sculpture on the grandest scale imaginable. This would be his life's work. He immediately traveled to the quarries of Carrara. He spent 8 long months there, walking the white, sun-blasted mountains, living among the stonecutters. He was not just buying marble, he was searching. He was selecting the perfect, flawless block for every single one of the 40 statues. It was a colossal undertaking, and he was in heaven. He returned to Rome, and the blocks of marble began to arrive, a river of white stone. Soon, the piazza of St. Peter's was filled with the sight of hundreds of perfect marble blocks, all waiting for his chisel. His grand dream was there, in physical form, but the Pope's attention had shifted. Julius was a man of many grand projects, and his mind had been captured by another, even larger, idea. He had decided to tear down the ancient, crumbling St. Peter's Basilica and build a new one. A new church, the grandest in all the world. The architect for this new basilica was a man named Donato Bramante. Bramante was a brilliant artist, but he was also a rival of Michelangelo's. He was a painter and an architect, and he was now the Pope's most trusted advisor. Suddenly, the funding for the tomb dried up. The money that was meant for Michelangelo's statues was diverted to the new church. The artist, who had dreamed of this project, was left waiting. He would go to the Vatican for the funds he was owed, and he would be turned away. The Pope, he was told, was busy. Michelangelo's mind, already prone to suspicion, began to darken. He grew paranoid. He became convinced that Bramante was his enemy. He believed Bramante was poisoning the Pope's mind against him, slandering his name. He even came to believe that his rival was trying to have him assassinated. He felt the cold, paranoid fear of walking the Roman streets at night. He imagined assassins in every dark alley. His situation became a public humiliation. The Pope, his patron, now refused to even see him. And all those perfect marble blocks, his hundreds of perfect marble blocks, lay abandoned in the piazza, a testament to his shattered dream. The feeling of profound humiliation and artistic rage boiled over. In 1506, in a fit of pride and fear, he fled. He did not ask for permission. He got on his horse and rode for days, the smell of horse and dust on the desperate ride back to the safety of Florence. He had defied the most powerful man in Christendom. Julius was furious. He sent messengers demanding his artist return. Michelangelo, safe in Florence, refused. The Pope's rage was absolute. He threatened the city of Florence with war. He would lay siege to the city if they did not return his sculptor. The government of Florence, terrified, urged Michelangelo to go back. he returned, a man condemned. He was forced to kneel before the Pope, who, after a tense, booming lecture, forgave him. But the tomb, his beloved tomb, was dead. It was put on hold, indefinitely. Instead, Julius had a new commission. It was a punishment, perhaps, a task that Bramante had cleverly suggested, a task that he hoped the sculptor would fail. The new commission was not to sculpt, but to paint. He was to decorate the vast 12,000 square foot vaulted ceiling of the Pope's private chapel. He was horrified. He stood in the vast, empty chapel and looked up. The ceiling was a simple, dark sky, a field of blue painted with gold stars. He was to cover it all. He protested, he argued, he famously and desperately told the Pope, "I am not a painter." This was not false modesty. This was a statement of his identity. He was a sculptor. His mind worked in 3 dimensions. His entire artistic philosophy was about taking away, about carving, about liberating the form from the stone. Painting was adding on. It was an illusion. It was a lesser art. And what's more, he had not practiced large-scale fresco painting in almost 20 years. Not since he was a teenage apprentice grinding pigments in Ghirlandaio's workshop. He was convinced it was a trap. He believed his rival, Bramante, had suggested him for this very reason. He knew Michelangelo was not a fresco painter. He knew how difficult the technique was. He was setting him up to fail. He wanted to see the great sculptor embarrass himself on the largest, most visible stage in Rome. The hollow, echoing sound of his own frustrated shouts filled the empty chapel. But the Pope was unbending. The commission officially began in 1508. The Pope's original idea was for a simple design, the 12 apostles seated in niches. But Michelangelo's pride, his ferocious, arrogant genius, could not accept this. If he was being forced to do this, he would not do a poor thing. In a stunning, bold move, he rejected the Pope's simple plan. He proposed his own. It was a design of staggering complexity. Not 12 figures, but over 300. Not just the apostles, but the entire story of Genesis. 9 vast central panels surrounded by prophets, sibyls, and the ancestors of Christ. The Pope, perhaps stunned by the audacity, agreed. The technical problems began immediately. First, he had to build the scaffolding. He designed a unique, complex wooden platform that did not rest on the floor. It was a bridge, suspended from holes drilled high in the walls, leaving the chapel floor free for services. Then he had to relearn the art of fresco. He called a team of assistants from Florence, painters who knew the technique. He began with the frustrating process of transferring his giant paper cartoons to the ceiling, pouncing charcoal dust through tiny holes. They began work on the first scene, the deluge or the Great Flood. It was a disaster. Michelangelo, in his inexperience, had made the plaster, the intonaco too wet. The gritty, wet, sloshing feel of the plaster in the bucket was wrong. One morning he climbed the scaffolding and was met with a sickening sight, a creeping, web-like mold. The muffa was growing all over his beautiful, freshly painted scene. The acrid, damp smell of it filled his nose. It was ruined. He fell into a panic. He ran to the Pope's palace. He told Julius that he was a failure, that the project was doomed, that he was not a painter. He begged to be released from the commission. The Pope was unmoved. He ordered him to go back to find the solution. Michelangelo returned to the chapel. He scraped the entire moldy fresco off the wall. He adjusted his plaster recipe, making it drier, and then he fired his assistants. He sent them all back to Florence. He scraped away the mold, and in that moment, he decided to do the work almost entirely himself. This began a solitary 4-year ordeal of physical and mental torment. The work lasted from 1508 to 1512. 4 years. He was almost completely isolated. He lived on the scaffolding. He was 60 feet above the chapel floor, alone with his work. He rarely came down. He ate poorly. His meals consisted of stale bread and a little wine, often hauled up to him in a basket. He slept on the scaffold itself, on a simple cot, when exhaustion finally overtook him. The chapel became his world. The smell of wax from the candles, the damp plaster, and his own unwashed body were the only air he breathed. And then there was the pain. The work was a form of physical torture. He later wrote a famous, sarcastic poem describing his barbarous posture. He was stretched like a Syrian bow, he wrote, for hours on end. Every single day he was forced to crane his neck back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above. My beard turns up to heaven, he wrote. Think of this, the constant, dull, burning ache in the muscles of his neck and shoulders. My spines all knotted from the strain. He was twisted, contorted, his joints stiffening in the chill of the vast chapel. He developed severe spinal problems. He developed a goiter, a painful swelling in his neck from the constant strain. My face, a rich pavement from the paint drops. He was painting *buon fresco*, wet paint on wet plaster. He was working against gravity. The stinging, watery sensation of plaster dust and colored paint falling into his eyes was a constant torment. His vision was permanently strained. When he did, on rare occasions, climb down to the chapel floor, the world was disorienting. His balance was compromised. He was so used to looking up that he could not read a letter unless he held it high above his head. His body had been deformed by the work. This physical agony was matched by the mental torment. He was isolated, and he was in constant bitter arguments with Pope Julius. The warrior pope was not a patient man. He wanted his chapel finished. He would have himself hauled up onto the scaffold, his old body groaning, to inspect the progress. He would stand there and yell, "When will you finish?" And Michelangelo, in a fury, would yell back, "When I can." On one famous occasion, the Pope grew so enraged by this answer that he hit Michelangelo with his staff. He struck him. Michelangelo was a proud, sensitive man. This was an intolerable insult. He immediately climbed down, left the chapel, packed his tools, and left for Florence. The Pope was aghast. He had lost his artist yet again. He was forced to send a diplomat racing after Michelangelo, carrying a bag of gold and a formal apology, begging him to return. He returned, and the work continued. Despite the pain, the paranoia, and the impatience of the Pope, the work progressed. Section by section, a new universe of powerful prophets, graceful sibyls, and the story of creation itself emerged from the plaster. The final phase of the painting was done at a frantic, desperate pace. He was painting the central, most iconic scenes, the creation of Adam with its 2 fingers, charged with the spark of life. The ceiling was a universe of its own. It contained over 300 figures. Each one was a masterpiece of anatomy and emotion. The narrative runs from the beginning of time, the separation of light and darkness, to the fall of man, the drunkenness of Noah, the figures of the ignuity, the nude youths, were revolutionary. The powerful, brooding figures of the prophets, like Jeremiah, seemed to be sculptures carved from paint. He had not failed as a sculptor. He had, instead, translated the power of sculpture into a new medium. In late October of 1512, the work was finished. The loud, crashing sound of the wooden scaffolding being dismantled, piece by piece, echoed through the chapel. And then, for the first time, the sudden, breathtaking, dizzying view of the entire, vibrant ceiling was visible from the floor far below. The ceiling was unveiled on All Saints' Day. A public mass was held. The Pope, the cardinals, the artists, and the people of Rome crowded into the chapel. The rich smell of incense from the mass rose up, mingling with the fresh scent of the plaster. The flickering candlelight illuminated the vibrant, fresh colors for the very first time. The reaction was one of stunned, universal awe. The collective, hushed gasps of the crowd were the only sound. People were dumbfounded. They had never seen anything like it. Giorgio Vasari, his biographer, wrote that the ceiling struck all who saw it dumb, and that the chapel could not be more beautiful. In that moment, Michelangelo's reputation was sealed. He was no longer just a great artist. He was *il divino, the divine. The greatest testament to his victory came from his rival, Raphael. When Raphael saw the ceiling, he was so humbled by its power, its new vision of the human form, that he immediately changed his own style, absorbing Michelangelo's power into his own. The ceiling was finished. 4 years of torment had created a new wonder of the world, and the man who climbed down from the scaffold was forever changed, his name synonymous with genius itself. He had done it. The sculptor, who was not a painter, had created a new heaven. As the crowds gazed up in silent wonder, the man at the center of it all was simply ... exhausted. His body was aching, his eyes were sore, but he had proven his genius to the world and to his rivals. He had transformed a vast, empty space into a testament of divine creation, paying for it with his own health and sanity. This agonizing struggle, this triumph, closes the central chapter of his relentless life. But the man himself, the solitary, tormented soul, remains. As you settle in and your breathing slows, let's explore the quiet, private world of the man behind the masterpiece. The story of the art is told. The ceiling is painted. The statues are carved, and the dome is raised to the heavens. The great public works, the battles with popes and patrons, the struggles against the stone itself have reached their conclusion. But the man who did these things, the hand that held the chisel, the mind that wrestled with the divine, remains, for many, a figure shrouded in marble dust. We have spoken of the artist. Now, as the great halls of history grow quiet and the crowds disperse, we can wander through the private corridors of his life. We can look at the man, not the legend. And the man we find is one of profound and deeply human contrasts. He was a creature of shadow and light, a soul who built a fortress around himself, and yet yearned for a connection he rarely found. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti, and this, in the quiet of the night, is the story of the man who lived behind the stone. Our first stop on this quiet journey is his home, or rather, the spaces he occupied. To call them a home would be to give them a warmth and comfort they almost never possessed. We must understand his habitat, the place where the artist vanished and the ascetic remained. Despite his fame and the truly immense wealth he acquired over his long life, Michelangelo lived like a poor man. He was, as one contemporary famously remarked, as rich as a pope, but lived as a pauper. This was not an affectation. It was a core tenet of his existence, a discipline as rigorous as his study of anatomy. He simply did not care for comfort. It was a distraction, a waste of precious energy that could be funneled into his work. His studio in Rome was not the grand, organized workshop of a Renaissance master. It was a chaotic, dusty cavern. The air, even in the humid Roman summer, felt cold, chilled by the massive blocks of marble that stood everywhere like silent, waiting ghosts. The floors were thick with white marble dust, a fine powder that covered every surface like a permanent layer of snow. It got into his clothes, his hair, and his lungs. Tools were scattered, sketches were piled in corners. It was the den of a man who did not live, but only worked. His diet was a reflection of this severe focus. He ate sparingly, almost as an afterthought. There were no leisurely meals, no fine dining. Often, his supper was nothing more than a piece of bread and a glass of wine, consumed while standing, his eyes still fixed on the sculpture or drawing before him. We can imagine the sensation, the hard, stale crust of a loaf that had been sitting in the dusty studio for days. The sharp, rough taste of cheap country wine, swallowed quickly. It was not pleasure, it was fuel. It was just enough to keep the machine of his body working. He was utterly indifferent to the trappings of a gentleman. He cared nothing for fine clothes, for personal hygiene, or for the soft comforts of a well-kept home. His bed was a simple cot, piled with a few rough woolen blankets. His clothes were functional, coarse, and often unwashed. This was not the elegant, perfumed, and highly sociable world of his great rival, Leonardo da Vinci, a man Michelangelo famously detested. Leonardo glided through court life, a brilliant conversationalist, dressed in fine silks. Michelangelo was the opposite. He was grit and sweat and stone dust. He was the workman, the quarryman, the creator who wrestled, physically, with his materials. His assistant, Ascanio Condivi, who wrote one of the earliest biographies of the master, gives us a startling and telling image of this life. Condivi wrote that Michelangelo often slept in his clothes, and even in his dog-leather boots. He would be so consumed by a project, working for days and nights on end, that he would simply collapse onto his cot, fully dressed. This habit was not just occasional. Condivi reports that he sometimes went so long without removing these boots that when he finally did, the skin softened and rotted by the trapped moisture, peeled off with them, like a serpent shedding its skin. It is a shocking image, but to Michelangelo, it was trivial. Pain was temporary, comfort was irrelevant. He saw this intense discipline as a virtue. All of his energy, all of his focus had to be saved for his art. He famously said that his art was his wife, and his works were his children. It was a demanding, jealous spouse, and it permitted no rivals, not even his own body. He was, in essence, a monk. But his devotion was not to a religious order, it was to the stone. It was to the act of creation itself. And yet, this was not the behavior of a simple miser, hoarding coins beneath his dusty cot. There was another side to this frugality. While he denied himself every comfort, he was fiercely, almost obsessively, generous to his family. Almost all of the money he earned, the vast payments from popes and princes, was sent back to Florence. He sent it to his father and to his brothers, whom he supported tirelessly. He was desperate to restore the status of the Buonarroti family, to buy them land, to secure their position as gentlemen. He wrote them endless letters, full of advice and often frustration. He was securing their future. So the man who ate stale bread and slept in his boots was, at the same time, purchasing villas and farms for his relatives. He lived in squalor so they could live in comfort. His denial of self was, in its own way, a profound act of providing for his lineage. He was the family patriarch, ruling from his dusty Roman cave. His power measured not in the silks he wore, but in the property he could acquire for the Buonarroti name. This intense, frugal focus on work was not just about discipline. It was also a fortress against a world he found deeply untrustworthy and hostile. And so, we move from his studio into his mind. It was a far more complex and far more guarded place. This was his fortress of solitude. Michelangelo was, by almost every account, a difficult man. He was famously short-tempered, suspicious, and profoundly solitary. In the Renaissance, this temperament was known as melanconico. It was the melancholy temperament associated with the planet Saturn, and in the view of the time, this melancholy was inextricably linked to creative genius. It was the burden of those who saw the world more deeply, who felt things more keenly. He was, in a word, brooding. His suspicion was constant. It was directed, quite often, at his own family. As we saw, he sent them nearly all his money, but he lived in constant fear that they were wasting it. We can almost see him standing in his cold studio, the chisel lying dormant for a moment. He unrolls a letter from Florence, the rustle of a letter from his brother, the only sound. He reads it with a suspicious, furrowed brow, his mind immediately jumping to accusations of waste and ingratitude. He would fire off angry replies, accusing them of squandering his life's work. This paranoia extended, with far more intensity, to his professional life. The artistic world of Rome was competitive and brutal. Michelangelo saw rivals and conspiracies everywhere. He was convinced that his great rivals, the architect Bronte and the painter Raphael, were plotting against him. He believed they were actively trying to steal his commissions, to sabotage his work, to poison his reputation with the Pope. He even held on to the belief that it was Bramante and Raphael who had convinced Pope Julius II to give him the Sistine Chapel commission, not as an honor, but as a trap. They were certain he, a sculptor, would fail at such a vast fresco project, humiliating himself and opening the door for their own advancement. This paranoia was so deep that he often worked in secret, behind locked doors. We can hear the sound of a heavy wooden door being bolted shut from the inside. He was terrified that other artists would see his methods, steal his compositions, or copy his revolutionary ideas. His genius was something to be guarded, like a treasure in a vault. This awesome, brooding, and difficult nature was the source of his terribility, his terribleness. It was a word used to describe both his art and his personality. His sculptures, like the Moses, had a terrifying, awesome power, and so did he. He was intimidating. He did not suffer fools. He did not engage in polite flattery. He was blunt, powerful, and deeply unsettling to be around. This terribility had a profound consequence on his career. Unlike other masters, Michelangelo failed to create a school of art. Raphael, his rival, ran a massive, efficient, and harmonious workshop. He had dozens of talented apprentices and assistants who adored him and who helped him complete vast numbers of commissions, spreading his style throughout Italy. Michelangelo could not. His apprentices and assistants simply could not stand to be around him. His personality was too abrasive. His standards were too impossible. His temper was too volatile. One by one, they left, unable to endure the crushing weight of his genius and his anger. The result was a studio of profound quiet. There was no chatter from young artists. There was no bustling collaboration. There was only the solitary master and the sound of his own hammer striking the chisel. He complained, in his letters and poems, that he had no friends. He insisted that he did not need them. But this was the classic defense of a man who found intimacy and trust almost impossible. His solitude was his shield. It protected him from the rivals he imagined in every shadow, from the family that disappointed him, from the apprentices who could not meet his standards. But that same shield became his prison. It isolated him, cutting him off from the simple, daily human connections that sustain the spirit. He felt this isolation keenly. In one of his most heartbreaking poems, he wrote a line that captures his entire existence. "I am alone, like the hangman." Think of this image, the hangman, a figure who performs a necessary, public duty, but who is shunned by all. He is touched by death, and no one will share his table. He is paid for his work, but he must live apart. This is how Michelangelo saw himself, a solitary figure, performing a vital, difficult, and divine duty for society, but one which, by its very nature, left him utterly and profoundly alone. He was the executioner of the stone, freeing the figures trapped within, but it was a lonely and terrifying calling. He distrusted almost everyone, and his gruff nature pushed them away. And yet, this profound loneliness was pierced by two remarkable and very different friendships late in his life. These connections reveal the hidden heart beneath the rough-hewn exterior. The first was a meeting of souls. Her name was Vittoria Colonna. They met in the late 1530s. Michelangelo was already in his 60s. He was the most famous artist in the world, an old, famously gruff, and intimidating legend. She was the Marchioness of Pescara, a noblewoman, a widow, and one of the most celebrated poets of her day. She was also a woman of deep, searching, and complex piety. Vittoria Colonna was a central figure in a Catholic reform circle known as the Spirituali. This was a group of intellectuals, cardinals, and nobles who sought a more personal, a more profound, and a more inward faith. They felt the Catholic Church had become too focused on ritual, wealth, and power. They were not Protestants, but they believed, as Luther did, that faith alone, a personal relationship with God, was the true path to salvation. In this, she found an immediate and profound connection with Michelangelo. He, the man who had painted the Last Judgment, was consumed by religious anxiety. He was terrified for the fate of his own soul. He feared that his life, dedicated to the idolatry of art and beauty, had been a sin. In Vittoria, he found someone who understood. She was not just an admirer, she was an intellectual and spiritual equal. She saw through his terribilità to the frightened, faithful man beneath. They would meet, often in the quiet, refined atmosphere of a Roman convent garden, a place of peace far removed from the dust of his studio. They would walk and talk for hours. They exchanged letters, and they exchanged poems. We can imagine the sound of poetry being read aloud, his rough voice, or her soft, intelligent one, discussing the nature of art, the mystery of faith, and the path to divine grace. Their relationship was one of deep, intellectual, and spiritual love. It was not romantic in the way we understand it. It was a Neoplatonic bond, a love of the mind and the soul. She became his confidant. She was his spiritual guide, the one person on earth he trusted with his deepest fears. He, in turn, gave her the one thing he truly valued. He made art for her. These were not grand public commissions. They were presentation drawings. He created for her, and only for her, a series of incredibly personal, exquisitely finished works. He drew a Pietà for her, different from his sculpture. This one showing Christ's body, held not just by his mother, but by angels, with a motto from Dante. He drew a crucifixion, a delicate black chalk drawing of Christ, alive on the cross, looking up to his Father. These drawings were not sketches. They were finished, private meditations, visual representations of the very spiritual conversations they were having. They were gifts from his soul to hers. In her, he found that rare, peaceful feeling of an equal, someone who did not want his art for status, but who understood its divine purpose. She was, perhaps, the only person who ever truly saw him. Then, in 1547, she died. Michelangelo was devastated. The loss shattered his carefully constructed fortress. His assistant, Condivi, wrote that the master was out of his mind with grief, that he wept for a long time. Years later, the old artist confided in Condivi, telling him of his one great regret from that friendship. He said that when he went to see her on her deathbed, he had kissed her hand, but he had not dared to kiss her face. This single, heartbreaking detail tells us everything. The reverence, the respect, the profound, unbreachable distance he felt, even with the person he loved most. He was the solitary hangman who, even in a moment of ultimate love and loss, could not bring himself to make that final human connection. This spiritual friendship softened the aging, gruff artist. Another, very different, relationship also brought light to his later years. This was a passionate, if complicated, love for a young Roman nobleman. His name was Tommaso de Cavalieri. They met in 1532. Michelangelo was 57 years old. He was at the height of his fame, but also deep in his melancholy, his Terraboletta at its peak. Tommaso was 23. He was a young, astonishingly beautiful, and deeply intelligent Roman nobleman. For Michelangelo, the meeting was electric. He was instantly and profoundly smitten. He saw in Tommaso's celestial beauty and noble mind a perfection he had previously only sought in stone. This young man was, to him, a living, breathing work of divine art. And so the great sculptor, the man who had no friends and spoke in grunts and bursts of anger, did something extraordinary. He began to write poetry. For Tommaso, Michelangelo composed dozens of passionate sonnets and poems. These were the first great love poems he had ever written in his life. We can imagine the artist, alone in his studio, the scratch of a quill pen on parchment, late at night. The poems use the language of profound, divine love and devotion. He calls Tommaso the light of our century, a cruel lord who has taken his heart captive. The passion is undeniable, and it is directed, unambiguously, at a man. Just as he had for Vittoria, he also created exquisite presentation drawings for Tommaso. These were not just gifts, but lessons. He sent him complex, meticulous black chalk drawings of Greek myths, the fall of Phaeton, the rape of Ganymede, the punishment of Tietus. These were not just studies in anatomy. They were deeply personal allegories about beauty, desire, and divine destiny. The exact nature of their relationship, whether it was physical or remained platonic, is still debated by historians. The intensity of the poems is so strong that it is hard to read them as purely philosophical. We do know that this love was seen as problematic by later generations. When Michelangelo's grandnephew first published the poems, more than 50 years after the artist's death, he censored them. He systematically changed the male pronouns to female, changing him to her, in an attempt to hide the true nature of his great-uncle's devotion. But to categorize it simply as physical or not physical is perhaps to miss the point, especially in the context of the Renaissance. For Michelangelo, this was a profound Neoplatonic love. This philosophy, which he had absorbed as a young man in the Medici court, taught that earthly beauty, such as the soft light of a Roman afternoon illuminating Tommaso's young noble face, was not a distraction. It was a reflection of divine, heavenly beauty. To love Tommaso, to admire his perfect form and brilliant mind, was a way of loving God. It was a ladder. The deep, aching, and inspiring affection he felt was a spiritual force, one that elevated his art and his soul. And what of Tommaso? This was not the fleeting infatuation of an old man for a young beauty. Tommaso de' Cavalieri returned Michelangelo's affection with a deep, unwavering, and profound loyalty. He became a devoted, lifelong friend. He was one of the few people allowed into the inner sanctum, a warm, accepting, and admiring presence in the dusty, solitary studio. He revered the artist, he learned from him, and he remained his steadfast companion. And in the end, it was Tommaso who was there. Over 30 years after they first met, when Michelangelo lay on his deathbed in 1564, an old man of 88, Tommaso de' Cavalieri was one of the small loyal few who stood by his side, holding his hand as he finally passed from the world of stone into the realm of spirit. This was the man behind the stone, a soul of profound contrasts, frugal yet generous to his family, paranoid yet capable of deep, trusting love. His life was a fortress of his own making, and his art was the only true window to his spirit. As we settle deeper into our rest, there is one final, vast legacy to explore. The work of an old man still grappling with his God. Our journey has been long. We have walked with the young sculptor in the gardens of the Medici. We have felt the spray of the dust in the quarry of Carrara. We have climbed the scaffolding in the Sistine Chapel and felt the ache in his neck as he painted a new creation. We have seen the fortress of his solitude and the few precious windows he opened to his friends. And now, as our journey comes to its end and the night settles into its deepest, most peaceful phase, we arrive at the final chapter. This is the story of an old man, a master who has seen everything, and who now, in the winter of his life, grapples, not with stone, or popes, or rivals, but with his own soul and with his God. This is the final judgment of Michelangelo. We return, after so many years, to that same sacred space, the Sistine Chapel. Decades have passed since he finished the ceiling. He began work on that vault in 1508, a fiery, proud, and ambitious man in his early 30s. He completed it in 1512, cementing his name for all eternity. Now it is 1536. More than 20 years have gone by. Michelangelo is in his 60s. He is a different man. The world he knew, the brilliant, confident, sun-drenched world of the High Renaissance, is gone. It was washed away in blood and fire. In 1527, the city of Rome, the Eternal City, had been brutally and horrifically sacked by the mutinous armies of Emperor Charles V. For months, the city was a living hell. Churches were desecrated, nuns were violated, priests were murdered, priceless artworks were destroyed, and the population of the city was decimated by the violence and the plague that followed. This was not a distant war. Michelangelo was in Florence, but the trauma echoed through all of Italy. It was an apocalypse, It shattered the comfortable Neoplatonic belief that man was the measure of all things. It proved that humanity was, in fact, still capable of profound animalistic brutality. And then, from the north, came the Reformation. Martin Luther had fractured the Church, and the certainty of faith that had defined 1,000 years was now a battlefield of ideas. This was the new era. It was an age of anxiety, of doubt, of fear, and of a new, more somber piety. This is the man who returns to the chapel, not the proud creator of Adam, but a humbled, anxious, and deeply pious old master. He has been commissioned by Pope Clement VII just before his death, and confirmed by his successor, Pope Paul III, to paint the most terrifying scene in all of Christian doctrine. He is to paint the Last Judgment on the entire massive altar wall. The wall itself felt different. It was not the high, distant ceiling, a vision of heaven and creation. This was the altar wall, the very center of the Mass, the wall behind which the Pope himself would celebrate the Eucharist. It was a cold, somber, and immense canvas of plaster, waiting for its final, terrifying truth. And what Michelangelo painted there was a reflection of his own and his era's darkened soul. The colors are not the bright, clear blues, greens, and pinks of the ceiling. They are dark, swirling, chaotic. The sight of dark, swirling blues and grays dominates. The entire painting is a vortex of bodies, a vast, terrifying wheel of fate, spinning around the central, immovable figure. That figure is Christ. But this is not the gentle, welcoming Savior of the Gospels. This is not the Good Shepherd. This is Christ, the Judge. He is a powerful, muscular, angry figure, more like a pagan sun god of vengeance than the merciful Redeemer. His arm is raised, not in blessing, but in a powerful, undeniable gesture of condemnation. At his side, the Virgin Mary turns her head away, unable to watch the terrible judgment her Son must now enact. Around this central, terrible Son, the souls of humanity spin. There is no calm, orderly ascension to heaven. The saved are dragged upwards, pulled by rosaries, their faces still etched with the memory of terror, and below, the damned are dragged down. The figures are heavy, writhing, and full of despair. Demons with burning eyes pull them from their graves, while Charon, the ferryman of pagan myth, beats them with his oar, forcing them onto the shores of hell. This was not what anyone expected. This was a complete break from tradition. It was dark, it was chaotic, it was pessimistic, and it caused immediate and massive controversy. The problem, for many, was not just the terrifying tone, it was the nudity. The ceiling had nudes, yes, but they were distant, idealized, classical figures. The Last Judgment was filled with hundreds of massive, muscular, naked bodies, front and center, right on the altar of the Pope's private chapel. And they were not idealized. They were heavy, strained, and all too human. The Pope's own master of ceremonies, a man named Biagio da Cesena, was his loudest critic. He surveyed the wall and declared it a disgrace. He said it was a work fit for a bathhouse, not a chapel, a vulgar display of indecency. He demanded it be covered. Michelangelo, now in his 60s, proved that his old fire had not been extinguished completely. He had listened to the criticism, and he delivered his response. In the bottom right corner of the fresco, in the very depths of hell, he painted the figure of Minos, the mythological judge of the underworld, and on that figure's head he painted a pair of donkey ears. The face, for all of Rome to see, was unmistakably that of Biagio da Cesena, and for good measure, he painted a large serpent coiling around Minos's body, its fangs biting him in a place of profound indignity. When Biagio complained to the Pope, Paul III is said to have joked that his own jurisdiction, unfortunately, did not extend to hell. The painting remained, but Michelangelo reserved his most profound and most personal statement for a small, strange detail. Near the center of the painting, just below the foot of Christ, is Saint Bartholomew. Bartholomew was a martyr who, according to legend, was flayed alive. In the painting, he holds the knife of his martyrdom in one hand, and in the other, he holds his own empty, flayed skin. If you look closely at that skin, at the grotesque, tragic, hanging face with its hollow eyes and drooping mouth, you are not looking at Saint Bartholomew. You are looking at a self-portrait of Michelangelo. This is the artist's final, haunting confession. He has painted himself as a shed skin, an empty husk, held in the hand of a saint, waiting at the feet of the ultimate judge. He is the artist who has spent a lifetime celebrating the human body, the idol of art, and now he presents himself as having shed that body. He is a tormented soul hanging in the balance, his art and his pride stripped away, leaving only the raw, empty hope for mercy. This dark, powerful masterpiece, a map of his own anxious spirituality, was his last great work in painting. His final years would be dedicated not to the body, but to the grandest building in all of Christendom, a final offering to the God he so feared. In 1546, at the age of 71, Michelangelo was appointed chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica. This was not a glorious commission, it was a rescue mission. The project had been underway for 40 years, a chaotic, disorganized, and colossally expensive endeavor. A series of architects, including his old rivals, Bramante and Sangallo, had come and gone. Their plans competed, their visions clashed. The result was a confusing, half-built mess of dark and complicated chapels, a forest of travertine with no clear, unifying vision. Michelangelo, at 71, was an old man. He had no desire for this project, but Pope Paul III insisted, and the artist finally, reluctantly, agreed. But he did so on one remarkable condition. He would accept no pay. He stated clearly and firmly that he was doing this for the love of God. This was not a job, it was an act of penance. It was a service to God and to St. Peter. His anxieties, so vividly painted on the altar wall of the Sistine, were now being channeled into this final, monumental act of devotion. He would build the house of God, not for gold, but for the salvation of his own soul. He began, as always, with a destructive, brilliant clarity. He despised the current plan by his predecessor, Sangallo the Younger. He called it complicated, dark, and weak. He tore it up. He demolished parts of what had already been built. And then, in a remarkable act of artistic humility and vision, he returned to the original plan, designed decades earlier by his most hated rival, the long-dead Bramante. He had loathed Bramante, believing the man had tried to ruin him. But he was an artist first, and he recognized the truth in Bramante's design. Bramante's original plan, he said, was clear and luminous. It was a perfectly centralized Greek cross, a form of pure, divine geometry. It was a symbol of God's perfection. Michelangelo took this plan and made it his own. He simplified it, he clarified it, and most importantly, he strengthened it. He thickened the central piers, the massive pillars at the heart of the church. He made them colossal, powerful, strong enough to support his true, ultimate vision. He would not just build a church, he would raise the heavens. he would build the massive, soaring dome. His design for this dome is one of the greatest feats of engineering and art in human history. He knew, from studying his hero Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, that a single shell dome of this size would collapse under its own weight. So, like Brunelleschi, he designed a brilliant double shell, one inside the other, held together by a powerful internal rib system. This was not sculpture. He was not carving away from a single block. He was defining the sky. We can imagine the old man, his hands, which had held the chisel for 70 years, now running over a massive, wooden architectural model. He would feel the curves, test the supports, visualize the stresses. He was no longer a solitary artist. He was a general, overseeing an army. We can see him on the vast construction site, an old, stooped figure in his familiar dark robes. He is surrounded by the distant, echoing sound of thousands of workmen, the chip-chip-chip of stonecutters, the shouts of masons, the groan of pulleys. He walks through the vast stone piers, looking up at the open sky, imagining the vast, light-filled, empty space that his dome would one day enclose. It would be a concrete symbol of the vault of heaven itself. He worked on this project for the last 17 years of his life. He was obsessive, battling with contractors, fighting against the committees who tried to alter his vision. He knew he would not live to see it finished. It was a race against time. When he died, he had only managed to complete the drum, the massive, circular base on which the dome would sit. But his plans, his models, his meticulous, scaled drawings of cross-sections and supports were so clear, so perfect, that the dome could be built. It was eventually completed, with some modifications, by the architect Giacomo della Porta. But it is, and always will be, Michelangelo's dome. It is the iconic feature that dominates the skyline of Rome to this day. A final, soaring testament, not of terror, but of hope, of engineering, and of a profound and unpaid devotion. As he built this final, monumental monument for God, his private thoughts turned ever inward. They were expressed not in stone and not in paint, but in the quiet, simple words of his poetry. Michelangelo wrote poetry throughout his life, but his earliest poems were often exercises in Neoplatonism or passionate, burning sonnets for his beloved Tommaso de Cavalieri. His latest poems, written in his 70s and 80s, are something else entirely. They are his final, most intimate, and most human confession. He never published them. They were not for the world. They were for himself and for God. We can imagine him, after a long day at the construction site of St. Peter's, returning to his dusty, simple room. He lights a single candle. He pulls out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook filled with his dense, spidery script, and we can hear the quiet, soft scratch of a quill pen on parchment. In these last poems, especially after the death of his spiritual guide, Vittoria Colonna, his anxiety about his salvation becomes the central theme. He grapples with his own sinfulness, his lifelong pride, and his desperate, simple hope for grace. In one of his most famous and most heartbreaking sonnets, he writes, "As an old man, my now spent life has run its course." He looks back on his entire glorious career, a life that the world called divine, and he is filled with a profound dread. He writes that art which he made my idol and my king has proven to be a vain fantasy. This is a staggering admission. The man who carved the David, who painted the Sistine ceiling, is now at the end of his days, afraid that it was all a distraction. He fears that in worshipping beauty, he was committing a form of idolatry. He fears he had worshipped his own genius, his own creative power, and had forgotten to worship the Creator. In another poem, he looks at his sculptures, his puppets, and asks, "What good is it to make so many puppets? The pride is gone, the terribiletta is gone. All that is left is the gentle, peaceful, and profound resignation of old age and the simple, terrified heart of a man standing before his God." But his poetry is not just despair. It is also a final, profound expression of faith. Having renounced art as his idol, he turns fully and finally to the only source of salvation he has left. He turns, as he wrote, to that love divine which opens to embrace us on the cross. He has, at last, laid down his hammer. He has laid down his brush, and he has laid down his pride. He is no longer Michelangelo, the divine artist. He is just Michelangelo, a man hoping for mercy. His art, his architecture, and his poetry all merged into a final, powerful testament. His last sculptures were not for popes or princes, but for himself, a final prayer in stone. In his final years, he began working on a large sculpture of the Pietà. This one, now called the Florentine Pietà, was intended for his own tomb. It was his most personal work of sculpture. It depicted not just Christ and Mary, but also Mary Magdalene and the figure of Nicodemus, who helped take Christ down from the cross, and the face of Nicodemus, hooded and grieving as he holds the body of his Savior, is another self-portrait. Michelangelo was carving himself, literally holding the body of Christ, placing himself within the sacred narrative of salvation. But the old, fiery perfectionist was still alive. One day, working on the marble, he found a flaw, a hidden vein in the stone. Or, perhaps, his own aging hand, now in his 80s, could no longer control the chisel with its old precision. In a fit of his old, terrible rage, he took a hammer and he smashed it. He mutilated the work, breaking off limbs, destroying his own self-portrait. He was still fighting, still battling the stone, and battling himself. But there was one last work, a final release. It is called the Rondinine Pietà. He was working on it just days before his death. It is unlike anything he had ever made before. It is a haunting, elongated, and almost ghost-like piece. The forms are thin, ethereal, and unfinished. It shows Mary, herself impossibly frail, struggling to hold up the impossibly thin, collapsing body of her dead son. Their two forms seem to merge into one, as if they are dissolving back into the stone or into the spirit world. This sculpture is a complete and total rejection of his early classical beauty. It is not the perfect, youthful Mary of his first Pietà. It is not the heroic, muscular body of the David. There is no anatomy, there is no polish, there is no worldly beauty. It is raw, spiritual, and deeply, deeply personal. It is a statement about death, about grief, and about the merging of the soul with the divine. The chisel, held in a weak but steady, very old hand, is no longer fighting the stone. It is releasing the spirit from it. It is his final, whispered prayer. And then it was quiet. Michelangelo died peacefully in his Roman studio on February 18, 1564. He was just a few weeks shy of his 89th birthday. His long, tormented, glorious battle was over. The quiet, rhythmic, shallow breathing in the simple, dark room finally ceased. His loyal friends, including the man he had loved for over 30 years, Tommaso de' Cavalieri, were at his side. The hammer rested. The city of Rome which he had transformed, wanted to claim him. They planned a magnificent tomb in his own St. Peter's, but his heart and his last wish had always been for his true home. His nephew, Leonardo, respecting that wish, secretly smuggled his body out of Rome. In a final, quiet journey, the master was returned to his beloved Florence. He was given a state funeral, a hero's farewell from the city that had first sparked his ambition. He was buried in the Basilica of Santa Croce, among the other great poets, philosophers, and artists of Tuscany. He was gone. The divine artist, the tormented soul, the solitary genius, was finally at rest. His body was returned to his beloved Florence, the city that first sparked his ambition. But his spirit remains. It lives in the quiet, watchful gaze of the David, in the muscular, tragic figures of the Last Judgment, and in the soaring, hopeful dome of St. Peter's that reaches for the heavens. He was a man who contained multitudes, anger and love, paranoia and faith, earthly struggle and divine transcendence. His life was not one of quiet contemplation, but a loud, brutal, and beautiful battle. A battle he ultimately won. Thank you so much for joining us here on Sleeping Scribe. It is a true privilege to share these stories with you. If you have enjoyed our journey tonight, your support, whether it is as simple like a subscription or sharing our channel with a fellow history lover, means the world. May your own journey into sleep be as peaceful as his final rest, and may your dreams be filled with wonder. Good night.